Okay, so I want to talk about another set of important nuclei, subcortical nuclei, below the level of the cortex, that are very important structures in the brain. This is a set of nuclei. There's actually quite a number of them, but they sort of cluster in these two great big left and right clumps of gray matter just above the brainstem that are referred to as the thalamus. And there's a thalamus on the left and a thalamus on the right. And they're very medial structures. Whoa, I just lost part of the brain. So anyway, that's good, because to be able to reveal the thalamus, you're going to have to take parts of the brain off. So we already removed part of the, inadvertently, part of the temporal lobe here and the occipital lobe back there, which is good. I'm also going to remove this structure. This thing, even though it looks small and its name cerebellum means sort of the little brain, it contains most of the neurons in your central nervous system. You've got 86 billion neurons, right? And about 69 billion are contained in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum has always been sort of dismissed in some ways as, being important for balance. Although, integrating vestibular information about acceleration, like where you're, how fast you're moving, which direction you're turning or going, is pretty critical for any sort of behavior, right? Including, modulating the muscles that generate, speech expression, or gesturing, or walking, or moving. So, or drug seeking. So any kind of behavior is going to involve, clear input from networks in the cerebellum. And there are definitely some drugs, for example, alcohol, that can impair, the integration of, balance information into, motor activity. And can lead to all sorts of, why you shouldn't drive a car. Right? So if I removed, the cerebellum, now the 69 billion neurons are out. The temporal lobe has been removed, right, and part of the occipital lobe. You can see now you've got, this is the brain stem, right, and then we have the insular lobe sort of revealed, right, deep inside that lateral fissure. Remember that thumb of tissue, that's the cortex, that's the temporal lobe, has been removed. So you can sort of see part of the insula, which receives all that, visceral sensory information from the body. And below this insula, we're going to see is the thalamus. So I'm going to take off, actually, the frontal lobe as well. This model is tough to work with. Okay, here we go. And then I'm going to take off one side here. So now you can really see. Here is the brain. This is the spinal cord down here. The brain stem, the medulla, the pons, and this is the midbrain, where we're going to see there are many important nuclei that are dopaminergic, that are going to be actually projecting and releasing dopamine in other portions of the brain that are involved in drug use disorders and just in general in motivated behaviors. Here is our hypothalamus again right here. And this sort of egg-shaped structure, you're seeing it, it extends in this way. It's this sort of egg-shaped structure. I'll pull open this in a second. But this is a clump of all these different nuclei called the thalamus. And actually, let's take a look at it here a little bit better. So here we just have our, brainstem, and then this structure here is going to be our thalamus, and it sort of extends around here. And the thalamus receives incoming afferent inputs, like incoming sensory inputs. So from the eye, there are going to be cables that leave the eye, carrying information about, what electromagnetic radiation has struck and been absorbed, basically back to a specific nucleus in the thalamus, before that thalamic nucleus then projects and sends information about visual input into the occipital lobe of cortex in the brain. And information from your ears actually is going to also, work its way up through the brainstem and then ultimately make a synaptic connection in the gray matter of the thalamus before it sends axons, white matter, out to the temporal lobes of the brain, right? And for touch, for example, and position proprioceptive sense, that also is going to work its way up into the thalamus, into a thalamic nucleus, before being sent into the parietal lobe, for, mapping, remember in that somatosensory strip, somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. Remember also that the hypothalamic information, the afferent information about the internal environment of the body, the internal milieu, as it's called, your pH level, your temperature, the salt and water balance in the blood, all of that information is also going to work its way up into a specific thalamic nucleus before being sent on to the frontal lobe. Remember the anterior cingulate in the medial portion of the frontal lobe. So the thalamus is a very important sort of sensory way station, like a node in the incoming, that's sort of placed in the networks that are receiving sensory information from the eyes and the ears and the hypothalamus and the body, and the cortical regions where that information is then mapped, at a higher level. And the thing to know also about the thalamus is that not only is there ascending information, like bottom-up information about sensory input, on its way to cortex, sort of stopping in specific nuclei in the thalamus before being distributed to cortex, but the cortex also sends back significant feedback, sort of top-down information into the thalamus. So you make predictions based on context about what you might find or see or hear or feel, in different environments, and you influence the gating of this afferent input into the cortex, via feedback, into the thalamus. So the thalamus is a really important kind of, they sometimes call it the gateway to sensation, right? It's a whole bunch of nuclei in the middle of the brain here that are absolutely critically involved in sort of receiving and distributing, afferent or sensory information around the cortex.